Okay, so today we're going to be looking at something kind of a sensitive topic,
Hmm.
something that a lot of couples, I think, deal with, but maybe don't talk about a lot.
Yeah.
Intimacy after childbirth.
Yeah, big one.
And we're taking a look at this through the lens of a Reddit post
Okay.
from a user called Raspberry Twilight.
Okay.
She's 32 years old, and she's saying that she's having a tough time meeting her husband's expectations for sex. He's 35.
It's interesting, it's something that I think we see a lot of silence around, even though it's very, very common. And what I find particularly interesting about this post is that it really seems to open up a whole web of interconnected issues.
Hmm.
We see exhaustion, there's elements of resentment, that invisible mental load of motherhood, and then there's even these hints of potential coercion.
Yeah, and I mean, she really paints a picture of her everyday life.
Yeah,
Breastfeeding her 1-year-old who has severe food allergies.
right.
So she's preparing all the baby's food from scratch,
Yeah.
trying to manage this demanding toddler, and she's getting very little sleep,
Yeah.
all while feeling this pressure to be, quote unquote, ready for intimacy as soon as her husband walks in the door.
It's almost palpable, that exhaustion and frustration. You can really feel it when you read through the post.
Right.
She even talks about these, 30-minute timer-controlled encounters, which sound more like a chore that has to be completed than
Yeah.
a source of mutual pleasure or connection.
Right, and it seems like a lot of the commenters also picked up on that resentment
Totally.
that's kind of simmering under the surface. She talks about feeling like a bad wife
Mm-hmm.
and how her husband kind of expects her to just step away from the baby already showered and prepared for him.
Yeah, I mean, this is classic, right? This imbalance of power
Yeah.
where one partner kind of leverages what they perceive as their needs to control the other partner.
Yeah.
And, a lot of times that can happen in kind of subtle ways, like
Yeah.
guilt tripping or some emotional manipulation. But it really raises this question, whose needs are actually being prioritized in this relationship?
Right. And it's so clear that she is carrying the majority of the parenting burden,
Yes.
but she's the one feeling inadequate.
Yeah. The Reddit community definitely did not hold back when it came to calling out the husband's behavior and his lack of support.
No, they did not.
I mean, some of those comments were pretty scathing.
They were spicy.
It's fascinating, though, because you can see how that comment section really becomes this microcosm of the larger conversation that's happening in society
Yeah.
about intimacy and relationships.
Yeah, you see all these different perspectives, right?
Yep.
You have some that are incredibly supportive, validating her feelings, urging her to prioritize her own well-being.
Right.
Others offered practical advice like, batch cooking the baby food, exploring childcare options,
Hmm.
and really emphasizing that communication piece, like talking to her husband directly and honestly about her needs.
Hmm. One commenter I thought had a really great suggestion. They said, and I'm paraphrasing here, but that instead of demanding intimacy, the husband should actually be offering support and contributing more to their child's care so that Raspberry Twilight could actually have a little bit of time and space to feel like an individual again,
Yeah,
let alone be interested in sex.
that's huge.
Yeah.
And then there was that other comment that was like, I wouldn't be craving sex with a partner who treats me like a masturbatory aid either.
Oh, wow.
Which, I mean, it's harsh,
It's
but
harsh, but it's true.
it's very true. And it really highlights that imbalance of effort
Yeah.
and understanding in this relationship.
And it really gets to the core of it, right? It's like intimacy is not just about frequency, it's about that emotional connection
Right.
or that lack of connection, which in this case seems to be the root of the issue.
Totally. And I think this might be a good time to touch on the concept of the mental load.
Yeah.
That kind of invisible labor of planning and organizing and anticipating a family's needs.
Yeah.
Did you notice how many commenters actually brought that up?
Oh, absolutely. That's a critical part of this whole puzzle, isn't it? I
Mhm.
mean, the mental load often does fall disproportionately on women,
Yeah.
and that can lead to burnout, resentment, which in turn, significantly impacts a couple's intimate life.
There was one comment I thought was really powerful. It said, "You can't put off pooping forever. You aren't procrastinating when you slow down for a few minutes instead of preparing to role-play a fleshlight. You're actually burned out and need rest."
Wow.
Which is, I mean, it's a little bit crass, but
It's very direct.
it's very direct, and it really gets to the point
It does.
of just how exhausted she is.
It's addressing that, yeah, that very real exhaustion that she's experiencing. Her body, her mind, they're constantly in mom mode.
Right.
So there's really no room for desire or pleasure.
And that's something, I mean, I think we really need to talk more about the physiological and psychological impacts of postpartum recovery
Mhm.
on a woman's desire and capacity for intimacy.
Yeah, I think that deserves its own deep dive.
It really does.
And it's not just the physical exhaustion.
Right.
There's this huge emotional and psychological shift that happens postpartum.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the hormones are going crazy, you're sleep deprived constantly, and a woman's sense of identity is often changing.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's not just about like snapping back into shape.
Right.
It's this whole transformation of self that women are going through.
Exactly.
And I think society doesn't really make space for that process,
No, it doesn't.
which just adds to the pressure.
Absolutely. And it makes me think about this one really insightful observation from the Reddit thread.
Okay.
One commenter suggested that maybe the husband is misinterpreting this lack of sex as a lack of love.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I think that really speaks to these deeper communication breakdowns. That can happen when couples aren't addressing their needs and expectations openly.
Totally. And it makes you wonder
Yeah.
if he's really just expressing a need for sex
Mhm.
or if it's a deeper need for connection and reassurance.
It is, and it highlights the importance of really trying to understand what are the underlying motivations
Right.
that are driving our behavior and the behavior of our partner.
Yeah. Well, and she mentions that he's recording her crying
Oh, wow.
and seems to be using that against her,
Mm-hmm.
even hinting at divorce if things don't change.
Yeah, that's a really alarming detail
It is.
because it brings up these concerns about potential of emotional manipulation and coercion.
Yeah.
And it reminds us that intimacy should never be a bargaining chip in a
Okay.
relationship. Healthy relationships are built on mutual respect, open communication,
Mm-hmm.
and a shared desire to meet each other's needs, not on threats or ultimatums.
And it's kind of heartbreaking that she might be internalizing his perspective,
Yeah.
blaming herself for something that's largely out of her control.
Mm.
She keeps referring to his needs and even labels herself as like a bad wife.
It's so telling, isn't it? It really speaks to how deeply ingrained those societal expectations can be,
Yeah.
even when they're actually working against our well-being.
Right.
It's almost like she's been conditioned to prioritize his needs over her own,
Yeah.
even when it's coming at a cost to her physical and emotional health.
And that brings us to another point that a lot of the commenters brought up,
Yes.
which is the importance of setting boundaries
Yes.
and prioritizing self-care.
Huge.
Yeah.
And I think this situation is such a powerful reminder that self-care is not selfish.
Right.
It's essential for our well-being and the health of our relationships.
Right. It's about knowing your limits
Yes.
and communicating them clearly
Absolutely.
and assertively.
And a lot of the commenters suggested that she sit down with him
Yeah.
and explain exactly how she's feeling without mincing words.
Mm.
And, this is where that concept of nonviolent communication can be really helpful.
Right. So instead of saying, you never help me with the baby and I'm exhausted all the time,
Yeah.
she could say, I feel overwhelmed with all the baby care responsibilities and I need more support from you so I can have some time to recharge and feel like myself again.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's about shifting the focus from accusations to needs
Mm-hmm.
and actually working together to find solutions that feel good for both partners.
I thought one commenter put it really well, and again, I'm paraphrasing, but they said that instead of putting the onus on her to make it happen,
Yeah.
the husband really needs to understand that her lack of desire is directly related to her circumstances right now,
Right.
and that his pressure is only making things worse.
And, it's not about faking desire or forcing yourself into a mold that doesn't fit. It's
Well-
about creating an environment where that intimacy can actually flourish naturally.
Yeah.
And that often requires a willingness to be honest about our needs,
Mm-hmm.
to listen to our partners without judgment, and to actually make adjustments that honor both individuals in the relationship.
There was this one comment that really resonated with me,
Okay.
and it was like, imagine if your daughter
Yeah.
was in the exact same relationship that you're in right now with all these details.
Mm-hmm.
Would you tell her to stay?
Wow. Yeah, that's a powerful reframing.
It is.
It challenges us to step outside of our own situation and look at it from a different perspective
Mm-hmm.
with compassion and concern for someone that we love.
It's like we always give better advice to other people
We do, it's true.
than we do to ourselves.
It's so true because we're often much quicker to recognize those red flags or those
Yeah.
unhealthy dynamics in someone else's relationship.
Right.
But when it comes to our own, we get caught up in
Yeah.
these justifications or fears,
Right.
and that clouds our judgment.
I love how the Reddit community, even though sometimes it's brutally honest,
Yeah.
they offer such a diverse range of perspectives.
They did.
You have everything from empathetic validation to people telling her to stand up for herself,
Mm-hmm.
to practical tips for how to deal with this phase of life.
And I think that really highlights the fact that there is no one-size-fits-all answer
Right.
when it comes to intimacy and relationships.
Yeah.
What works for one couple might not work for another, and that's okay.
Yeah. And I think it's important to remember that we're just scratching the surface here.
Yeah,
This is a much larger issue.
right.
You know, the postpartum period is so intense physically and emotionally,
It is.
and we need to provide more support and resources to women who are going through this transition
We absolutely do.
as a society.
And normalize these conversations
Mm-hmm.
about the challenges of postpartum recovery,
Mm-hmm.
the impact of the mental load on relationships,
Mm-hmm.
and the importance of prioritizing both partners' well-being.
Yeah, and create spaces where women feel safe to talk about their needs
Yes,
without judgment or shame.
I couldn't agree more.
It's interesting, you know, thinking about how this whole Reddit community became like a virtual support group for her.
Yeah, it is, isn't it?
It's nice to see that even on the internet, people can still find connection and understanding.
It really highlights, I think, the power of shared experiences and the importance of finding those communities
Yeah.
where we feel seen and heard, you know?
Yeah.
Even if we don't relate to the specifics of somebody's situation, just being able to listen
Mm-hmm.
and acknowledge their struggles,
Right.
it can be incredibly validating.
Before we wrap things up, I kind of want to bring it back to the listener.
Okay.
So imagine Raspberry Twilight was your daughter or your best friend. What advice would you give her, you know, based on what we've talked about today?
That's a good question. What would you tell her? Would you encourage her to prioritize her own needs? Set some boundaries, maybe some firmer boundaries with her husband?
Yeah.
Seek out some professional guidance for their relationship? Maybe even look into some resources
Yeah.
for postpartum recovery and support.
It's funny because sometimes I think when we give advice to others, it actually helps us clarify our own values and thoughts.
It's true.
Like it allows us to step back from the emotions and see things maybe a little more clearly.
Yeah, it's like that old saying, we teach best what we most need to learn.
Right.
So when we think about what advice we would give to someone we care about,
Yeah,
we often gain these valuable insights into our own patterns and our blind spots.
definitely. So I think from this whole deep dive, we can see how important these issues are. Postpartum recovery, the mental load, the communication, breakdowns, and how important it is to prioritize both partners' well-being.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, while it might seem obvious, it's always worth repeating consent. Intimacy should always be a mutually enjoyable experience that's
Yeah.
freely chosen,
Right.
not an obligation, not a bargaining chip. If you're not feeling safe, respected, or genuinely interested, you always have the right to say no,
Absolutely.
regardless of what's happened in the past.
Yeah. And, you know, it's interesting because even though we've been looking at this one very specific situation, a lot of the things we talked about today,
Right.
like communication, boundaries, self-care, consent, those are all universal.
They are.
You know, they apply to all relationships, not just romantic ones.
These are foundational, aren't they, for just building healthy relationships with ourselves and with others.
So to wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave everyone with this. Intimacy, in its truest form, is about vulnerability, connection, and mutual respect. It's about feeling seen,
Yeah.
heard, and cherished by your partner, you know, both in and out of the bedroom.
Beautiful.
And that kind of intimacy can only really grow when both partners are willing to put in the work, prioritize their own well-being,
Yes.
and communicate their needs honestly and openly.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And remember, cultivating those healthy relationships, it's a journey. It takes effort, patience, and a willingness to learn and grow, both as individuals and together.
Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. We hope it's been insightful and thought-provoking.
Yes.
Don't forget to subscribe to Voices of the Soul and follow Shauna Pelage on YouTube
Yes. Good advice.
for more content. We'll see you on our next deep dive.